When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
All right, Ashley Frawley, you're on the Zero Books YouTube live stream, which tends to be these days what we are putting out into the world. So I'm glad to have you back. The reason you're coming on this time is sort of not exclusively, but at least partly in response to Twitter controversy that you faced. You put out a tweet, or the person who's managing your Twitter put out a tweet, which included a video clip of you discussing Marxism and the Marxist vision for socialism, and how it's different than what the left generally thinks about or talks about today. So I guess what I want to do to start with is ask you to introduce yourself for people who don't know who you are yet, but also then to discuss or maybe just outline what you had said that was so controversial.
Shouldn't have been all that controversial, but anyway. So my name is Ashley Frawley. I'm senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University, and I'm the author of Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, and lots of essays and articles and so on for various magazines and media and the like. Okay, and what did you say that was so controversial? Oh yeah. Sorry, I should mention that my daughter broke my glasses, and so I'm now wearing my old glasses, and I can't see a thing, and it's really disconcerting. Anyways, So, I cannot watch myself back on videos. I hate the way that I talk, and it's embarrassing for me. But I basically. So this was part of an interview where it was like 20 questions, just very, very quickly, and one after the other. And I had to be like on my toes and asked a whole bunch of different things. And one of them was, what would you tell people watching at home, about the left? And I was like, I wanted to say that I wanted to dispel the myth that communism, that Marxism is against working people, and that it wishes to impoverish people, that it's about living like Smurfs, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It is about making life better, that it is about expanding and generalizing wealth, not going back to a golden past. Now, I actually didn't realize until I saw the clip back that I had said, a lot of Marxists hadn't read Marx and wanted to go back to the golden past. Now, I didn't necessarily think that there were a lot of like actual Marxists who want to go back to a golden past, because any Marxist worth their salt isn't gonna say something like that. But I had actually been talking to someone. The reason why I said that, I think, is that the day before I'd been talking to somebody about how I was going to give a lecture on something, and they said, "Oh yeah, use the Smurfs to talk about Marxism." And I was like, this was somebody who, like a sociologist who identifies as a Marxist sociologist. It uses Smurfs. And I was like, why would I use the Smurfs? Like, am I going to talk about fascism or something? Right. And I realized like that's a kind of a misconception, that it's about like primitive communism or something, like you wanted to go back to that. So that's kind of what I had in mind. And I also was thinking of like edgy teenagers who call themselves Marxists. But what's funny is that in the response that I got to this, I was actually confirmed, because I thought I was kind of making a sort of rhetorical jumping off point to dispel these myths, that's what because I don't think any Marxist worth their salt actually would say that sort of thing. But that is what people believe. Like, that's what they think. If you hear about like cultural Marxism and so on, like this plot to bring down Western civilization and destroy everything, impoverish people, make life worse, and so on. So I'm trying to dispel that myth. And so I was emphasizing the fact that, in 90 seconds and in the clearest language possible for people who know nothing about Marxism, that Marxism is about making that one-sided political liberalism, political liberalism's one-sided idea of freedom, which is certainly a step up from feudalism, that communism is about making that freedom real, because it needs, in order to not be one-sided, it needs an economic base, right? It needs, you need to have economic and social freedom as well, right? So without that, political freedoms are, they're always going to be one-sided or not fully realized.
Well, yeah, they're going to be in the realm of the market, or they're going to be legal freedoms, but they won't be positive material freedom.
Yeah, and that the great thing about Marx was that throughout history, if you there was always this separation between subject and object. So you had in terms of philosophy, so you had Aristotle thinking about philosophy in terms of logic and the mind, and our sort of animal kind of nature is something that's quite separate. And the wonderful thing about Marx is that he brings these things together, that you need to have that being is social being, and so you can't just have political freedom without social freedom, without economic freedom. Anyways, you can't say that on mainstream media. So, and particularly because I really think that the overemphasis on immiseration, people will look around and be like, what are you talking about? People are living much, much longer now than was the case 100 years ago. You're much less likely to die in childbirth and so on. And so it is about pointing out that, yes, capitalism does create good things, but it creates those things through exploitation, and it destroys those things, which, by the way, I carried on and continued to say in the rest of that clip. Right. And that it's about freeing those productive forces, right? So capitalism is pregnant with this society that is possible, and we have not figured out how to allow that to be born. But it is those industrial forces, those productive forces, that will provide the basis for freedom. So anyways, that's what I was trying to say. But, you've got 90 seconds, and you got to be a little bit provocative. And also Twitter is all about being provocative, which is
right. So what program was it that you were on?
Well, what's interesting is that actually this was just a test thing. So I wasn't really sure if it was going to air. It was possibly going to be part of like a longer sort of news thing. Like, I'm not really sure, like a documentary or something like that. And so it was just like, oh, we'll come in, we'll have you sit down, and we'll throw some things at you to see what you would be like on air if we do this. And normally, like, I've done lots of stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I've never got the footage because I can't bear to watch myself back. But a friend of mine who does these things and tracks down all my clips and stuff, he managed to get the footage and to create clips out of it. And like, there's another clip as well where I'm talking, and you can see that I'm like slightly embarrassed because I'm trying to think like, oh, how can I simplify this and say this in a way that's really going to jar people away from thinking that, that is about, this like, like primitive kind of ideas. Because that's what is associated with when you say communism. People think you're like hippies or like living off the land and that kind of thing. So I start talking about Star Trek and stuff. You can see that I'm like ever so slightly embarrassed. But I'm trying to like jar. And so he wants to put this clip out.
You just got to commit. I mean, you just need to.
Will I get hate on Twitter?
You need to get a little tape and put it between, in your glasses, make them really broken. Just look a little geekier. And then commit to that Star Trek metaphor. So I think that the difficulties that people might have who are on the left with what you said might come down to a couple of things. One is that a good number of people who are really attracted to left-wing politics are young people who don't have a lot of prospects and who don't feel like they have a lot of material support. So the story about immiseration, the idea that that this breeds inequality and undermines people, is an attractive one, and it's true enough, right? That when you're freeing the productive forces, you're not just freeing equipment, but you're freeing people to be to participate more in the realm of production, and that kind of production will be a very different experience because it won't be mediated by or disciplined by a drive to expand labor time. But all this is very difficult. You can't put that across on a mainstream channel in 90 seconds, right? because what?
No, and you can't. You just can't. You can't say certain things. Like I was quite lucky that I even managed to say Marxism.
Yeah, right.
And I suspect that's probably why it never aired.
When I was at the Battle of Ideas discussing socialism and trying to put forward my vision of socialism, I found it very difficult to get to some of the core ideas that I thought were important, because they required rethinking our relationship to the economy, thinking about, what the basis of prices are, what is really mediating our the market, and what the internal contradictions are, and all of that. If I said it flatly and technically, which I'm not always good at doing, it would have not registered. So I ended up saying very kind of bizarre things. if you remember, like so I referenced Star Trek and said, I feel like I'm the character on Star Trek that resorts to technobabble to explain the problem. But let me just tell you that we have to reverse the polarity of the neutron flow if we're going to get beyond capitalism. Right. Which didn't really mean anything to anyone, hardly meant anything to me, but at least got a laugh. So it is very difficult to, Chomsky talks about how the major media uses concision as a way to limit thought. Because if you have to be concise, that means you have to only say things that people are already thinking, that's already accepted. So you're working against that. But I guess
and also you have to work with that as well. You have to use that as a jumping off point. It took me a really long time to realize that. I've been doing mainstream media, like a lot of stuff, for about 6 years. And I did some very big things right at the very beginning when I was like 28. I did this show, this Channel 4 show with Richard Ayoade and Jack Whitehall. And like I hardly knew who these people were. Like I hadn't been in the country for like that long. Anyways, and the reason why they liked me and wanted me on the show was because of the way that I talk normally, the way that I'm talking to you right now, which is not the way that I would talk at a conference, which is, you use different rhetoric, right? But I thought, I'm a sociologist and I've got to be very careful about what I say here. I need to be very, very precise. And so when I was actually on the show, I was very, very boring and just like, and they were joking and stuff because they're comedians. That's what they do. And I was like, no, you see, we have to be, and I lost this opportunity. And indeed, there was an opportunity for me to, explicitly say something against overpopulation ideas and to point out how regressive these things were and what a slander on mankind they are. And I said it in such an obscure way, and that show never aired, so if you're trying to be absolutely precise in your language, you have to remember, you're not talking to people who already agree with you. You're trying to convince people. And that is really, really important. I actually have very little interest in kind of impressing other Marxists because ostensibly we already agree, kind of. We're supposed to anyway. But although Marxists aren't exactly famous for agreeing with each other.
No, I don't think we all agree very well.
No, but I want to counter these ideas of what the left is that are now mainstream and are really turning people away from leftist politics. I think it's a real problem. We do need to be able to talk to people, just talk to people in mainstream media, to talk to people's aspirations, and like when I think about it, when I think about how I was when I was first getting into leftist politics, very briefly, for like a brief moment, what attracted me was really this sort of countercultural rejection of capitalism, because I was like an edgy teenager. But very quickly, I was attracted by this idea, which I had never heard before in all the years that you hear of like what the left is and so on, and especially, as a teenager when you're like an anarchist, when you play with anarchist ideas and punk rock and that kind of thing. I had never, ever heard that the left would be about something better, futuristic, and abundance, and that capitalism is destructive, and that destructive of wealth creation, and that is part of the problem, that a world of wealth and culture is a precursor to revolution, because you can see all around you all of these possibilities, and then you're tossed out of the labor market. You're tossed out of even like just being exploited. There's a famous line, obviously, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. But you can see this world of wealth right in front of you, and you're told you can't have it. There's a great poem by James Connolly where he says, "Our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth." I want it all. I am a communist because I'm greedy.
Right. I think that one of the things that I'm going to say something that's controversial too, that I can put on Twitter and get a lot of people angry with now.
That wasn't my intention, by the way.
No, it's
I
always
didn't even put it up.
These days, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, but these days, a good marketing strategy is to get people mad at you on Twitter. But I'm not saying this for that reason. But one of the reasons why the anti-Marxist celebrities, people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, even, the IDW types, have legs, is because when they point to, let's say, postmodernism or post-Marxist thought or politics of a return to a simpler time or anti-modern thinking as Marxism, it plays, and it plays because there's a certain historical reality that's behind it, which is that post-Marxism and postmodernism did come along in the academy and supplant Marx, and the people who did it would still embrace the idea that they were Marxist, or they were socialists, or they were somehow connected to this really Enlightenment project of completing or getting to a rational, human-oriented, liberated society, and while abandoning even pretty simple notions of freedom along the way. So I guess one thing I want to ask you is, do you find that, like, there was an exchange you had with an actual educated Marxist, it seems to me, on Twitter there, that he came along, and he called you like a Randian or something, like he thought that your assertion that we should free the productive forces and inspire human creativity was something out of Atlas Shrugged. Remember this guy? Remember this?
Yeah, I think it's like, I don't actually have a lot of time to be on social media. It's probably the most time I've ever spent was the last couple of days. So whenever I'm on Twitter, there's always a baby screaming behind me or something.
yeah.
So I don't really remember that. Do you remember what I responded?
You know what? The reason I remember it so vividly is because I was probably the first one to respond to him. Your response was, "I did no such thing," and you kind of left it at that. You said that you were advocating for the continuation of exploitation or something like that. And you said, "I'm doing no such thing." And I said things like, the fact that you're a professor in anything is totally amazing. And and then I sent a clip to Annie Hall, where Woody Allen pulls Marshall McLuhan out from behind a...
Do you know how many times that went through my head when people were like, "This person is a sociologist"? I felt like Marshall McLuhan, like, "You know nothing of my work."
Right. So I sent them that clip. But I guess we have a couple of questions. I'm going to throw up a couple of questions here. Someone asked Ashley about the problem that Marx did not anticipate financial capital becoming the parasite obstacle to the socialist revolution he thought industrial capital was to usher in. So I'm bringing that to you, and I'm hoping you can handle it better than I would be able to this early in the morning. But what do you think about that? How Marx didn't see how financial capital and intellectual property both would rise up and stifle the development of socialism.
I'm not finished reading Capital Volume 2 yet, so my answer to this might change. But I think that in general, the rise of financial capital kind of makes sense within what Marx was already talking about, in that when it stops being profitable or sufficiently profitable to invest, so when you start needing to invest huge amounts of money in order to receive smaller and smaller returns, when you're talking about productive, like industrial investments, why would you do that, right? so what you wind up doing is investing in or tossing your money into bubbles, and it just makes logical sense, right? Like, why would you try to, build a factory to go into battle with, highly sophisticated existing capitals when you can give loans to students and get the interest, right? And they have to pay you back. Whereas you may not sell all of your productive goods. And I think that fits perfectly well within the falling rate of profit. So the understanding of that the alienation of use value from exchange value means that you wind up having to, you want it's been a long time since I've had to explain this. So you want to invest in order to, get exchange value. But in order to do that, you have to buy actual stuff. You have to buy means of production. And so you want like a steady stream of money separated, but you have to buy large means of production. And so, what you wind up doing is not doing that. Because as the investments get higher and the rate of profit gets lower, then we just see more and more bubbles. And we also don't see the kind of what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. You don't see people after a crisis buying up those big means of production and going back into production. You just see people making more bubbles.
Yeah. Let's see if there are any other questions that are.
I don't know. Can you ask that person if that was sufficient? Because I need to think about that a little bit more.
Well, they can hear you, so.
Okay, yeah.
Let's see. Someone says, I would argue that financialization is just a dominance of exchange value over use value, which Marx talked about.
Yeah, that's what I intended to say.
Yeah. So let's see. What I guess I want to talk about off to the side of diving into the theoretical problems that are in Marx, and then also the challenge of interpreting Marx's ideas in today's context, is to step into what for me is an easier thing to discuss, which is just the problem of communicating and thinking through these issues in today's media environment and in today's culture. And I wonder what you see the role of Twitter being for a Marxist project, which would require some theoretical rigor and engagement and an ability to not just react to ideas that seem counterintuitive. And along with that, I guess, what is the role of programs that it might be on the BBC or other major media networks that do have this problem of concision? Because the problem of concision is in both, certainly there in Twitter, but it's also there in the mainstream media. So I guess your strategy is to be kind of outrageous or to spark a response in a way to get past the wall of dullness that surrounds thoughts that aren't already being thought. When you encounter a new idea, there's maybe two responses. One is to reject it and kind of be outraged. The other is just not to comprehend it and for your brain to shut off, maybe. Anyway, I'll let you respond to that question of how do you overcome the challenge, and how are you thinking about using sometimes limited instruments to get ideas across?
Well, there's different levels of what you do, right? So obviously, I think writing and working out ideas is extremely important, and there are places for that. There are magazines that are open to, particularly now with their sort of fragmentation of media, there are magazines that are open to that kind of deep thought. I find that like books and particularly academic publishing is broken to a certain extent. It is a problem because of the proletarianization or deprofessionalization of academics. You don't have, it's amazing because it's the one area in society where we should be able to have the time to think, and we don't, right? So I teach I teach a lot. because I don't have funding to do research. And so, I pull an all-nighter at least once a week, and I go in and I teach without having slept. So I teach like
Really?
a lot.
Like
Oh, yeah.
literally
Oh, yeah.
with no sleep at all?
Literally with no sleep at all, about once a week, sometimes twice. It got to a point where it was twice. Because I was just teaching so much. And it's a shame because I love teaching, and that's why I put so much energy into it, why I stay up all night trying to plan these lectures. So you don't really have the time to think. But ideally, and it still kind of works, academic publishing is wonderful because that's really where you will get peer review, and you bounce your ideas off of other scholars, and also peer review happens after something is published as well, when people read it and they respond to it, and you have these arguments about deep sorts of ideas, and that's a very, very important thing. Books are really important. That's the foundation for, at least for all of my thinking, is having that tiny little bit of time, which is usually in the evenings, where you can kind of sit down and engage very, very closely with texts and write about them. I don't really absorb a text unless I write about it.
Yeah.
And in that sense, and when I do that, I'll memorize like large portions of a text because I'm like engaging with it so much.
Yeah.
And you need that, right? But that is a whole different animal than when you go onto Twitter, or when you go into the mainstream media, or even when you're teaching. And you have to have that foundation where you defend in full what you're saying, so that those who are interested and want to challenge you can go and actually see the full light of what you said. But the mainstream media is like a gateway to that. And Twitter is like a gateway to that. And you have to remember, of course, that we're all competing with all sorts of other people who are also doing the same thing, which is why, Twitter will sometimes mean that you have to say something provocative, apparently. I never really wanted to do that, by the way. I actually never wanted to draw attention to myself. I'm not a very confident person. I hope that no one will ever read anything that I write because I never think it's very good. But I recognize that, sunlight's the best disinfectant, and it's good to get people's, to get people to read my work. But you have to learn how to talk to people, how to explain things in a simple way. And when you do that, inevitably you lose nuance and you lose some of the exact the precision of what you're saying. But if you are perfectly precise, yes, you're going to impress your community of scholars, but you're only ever going to have a conversation with that community of scholars. So I always remember this line from Wage, Labor, and Capital, where Marx says, we will not presuppose even the most elementary knowledge of political economy. We want to be understood by the workers. And I always think about that, because you cannot presuppose knowledge of political economy if you want to be able to talk to people, if you want to be able to talk in the mainstream media, if you want to be able to attract people's attention to that deeper political economy. And by the way, I don't think everybody needs to be a philosopher. I'm not going to sit there and get angry with people because they don't know what the labor theory of value is. Do you think Che Guevara going out into the countryside to the peasants was I want to help you, but do you know about political economy? Are you a bit racist? Right. No, he wants to hear what people's struggles are, what people's aspirations were. Mm-hmm. And there's a very cheesy line that Che Guevara recognized was cheesy, which was that the revolutionary is guided by feelings of great love. I feel like we lose something if we forget about that, because the people who call themselves revolutionaries are often guided by feelings of great hatred for the masses. And I think that can be very dangerous. And we can go down a very dangerous and anti-human path if we forget that the Marxist project was fundamentally a humanist project.
I think that some people who call themselves Marxists might be motivated by feelings of great hatred towards the masses. I don't think any honest-to-God revolutionary can be. I just don't think he can be. If you don't have a fundamental trust and love of people and our collective ability.
Not people as victims, not people as
no, but if you don't
kind of thing.
Yeah, but if you don't have confidence in humanity's capacities to do great things and to be really awe-inspiring and wonderful to one another, if you don't have a fundamental respect for just the other person, then you're not gonna. Then what are you doing? Why would you get involved in emancipating and freeing the humanity? If you feel that humanity is innately sinful and nasty, why not just be a right winger? I mean, that's the right wing
absolutely
worldview. And, so that you do risk appearing naive and maybe bleeding heart or something, but it just is fundamental to the left's perspective, to this perspective of emancipation and freedom, that humanity has the capacity for wonders and goodness, and that our job is to free that capacity to unchain the masses, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the loss of this kind of powerful sense of the human subject has been a really profound one for the left, because the whole point is to free human potential and human creativity. And if you don't trust in human beings to be able to live their lives without state intervention, right? Because the idea is a stateless society. That's what we're going toward. If you think that the masses kind of have to be educated to be able to have the subjectivity that will allow that, then you've really sort of lost faith in the masses. Like Lenin, State and Revolution, he says, we want revolution as people are today, not as they were 50 years ago, not as we hope they will be. So if you're like sort of scoffing at people's aspirations, oh, they're too consumerist. Well, they should be. They should want more. We should want more what's being kept from us. And it shouldn't be created on our backs and through horrific alienation. We shouldn't be alienated from the fruits of our labors, from the thing that frees us.
I think this point about consumerism was one of the things you said in that clip that maybe got the most negative response on Twitter, or was one of the things that got a big negative response, was that you advocated for a consumerist mentality in a way that you were pushing back against the usual critiques of consumerism that have been dominant, say, since the 60s on the left. So just to be real quick here and just give you a chance to say it again and overcome what I'm about to say, the critique of consumerism is that it creates a passivity in people, and that rather than being three-dimensional and aspirational towards freedom, the consumerist approach to life, the lifestyle that's being sold in especially America, pacifies and infantilizes the population. And I think when everyone's can get a Big Mac, there's no chance for revolution might be a really simplistic way of saying it. So what do you think about that? It's
interesting that you should mention Big Macs. In what was that book, Red Plenty? There's this little anecdote about, I can't remember who it was. Was it Khrushchev? I can't remember. A Soviet leader who went to the United States and came across like a burger cart, and he was like, "This is communism. This is great. This is wonderful. We need to have these in the USSR." Like you think about that, like the ability to create a very, very, very quickly and very cheaply, like a very nutrient dense thing is fantastic. Like in a world in which people are starving, that is amazing. We can do that with very little human labor. In fact, we could probably do it with robots eventually, and feed people is fantastic. But yeah, I think like that world of wealth and culture, not only one tells us what's being kept from us. So a couple of times people told me, so there's another clip that I posted, that person posted, but of me saying that, giving that like that bit from Wage, Labor and Capital, where he says a house may be large or small, as long as the surrounding houses are likewise small, it satisfies all requirements for residents. Let there rise next to the house a castle, and the little house shrinks to a hut, which is like always misinterpreted, right? But what Marx is saying with that is, he says that needs are relative, but also that the capitalist will say, look, capitalism is fine. It's a wonderful system because your wages grow. And he says, but our wages will always be smaller in proportion to that which is taken by the capitalist. And their world, the thing that they enjoy from birth, is the thing that we can see it, we can see, and people will say like, oh, it's so bad that, people can see all that wealth and it makes them discontent. No, it's the discontent that tells you the capitalist is lying to you. that he is living off of your sweat and blood. He's living in a castle that you yourself built and is telling you that that is right and that is fine. And you will look at that and you will say, no, that's not right. And like a modern analogy for that would be like, look at all these houses. People will scoff at like McMansions, right? But they're sitting there empty. Well, people are homeless. That is the world of wealth that's being kept away from us. And our recognition of it, our recognition that we can't have that, and yet we should. That why can't I live in that house? It's right there in front of me. Tells you that there's something about this system, which means it is not the end. It is not the end. And in fact, at a certain point, it comes into contradiction with the furthering of wealth, with the furthering of the creation of wealth. And I'm not misquoting the Communist Manifesto. He literally says, at a certain point, he says the conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by it. The capitalist is like the magician who's unable to control the forces he has conjured up from the netherworld.
Right. Yeah, like the sorcerer's apprentice, right, with the brooms going out of control. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and you think like everybody should have a McMansion. Think about how quickly those things go up, and like these little matchstick places. Yeah, but that's amazing. Like how fast we can throw up these houses, and how relatively cheaply we can do that. That is like that mass production forms the basis of a situation. Think about what the world would be like if you had that security of a home. And like imagine if I show this clip to my students sometimes, like 3D printers that are like 3D printing houses, with the cement and all that stuff. Like we could work toward that. This idea that we should all be philosophers and find our enjoyment within ourselves is not something that Marx, thought would be a good thing necessarily. I mean, I think that comes from, neo-Marxism and that particular reading of the 1844 manuscripts that really reads Marx as an anti-materialist. I don't think so. The problem is that all of this is created on our backs, but we're also, through the process of capital accumulation, we're also creating these things through more and more machinery. And now that's really, really bad for capitalism. It's great for individual capitalists, but it's really bad for capitalism as a whole. But that's really good for humanity. The problem is within capitalism, that's horrific for humanity. And yet you can see this glimmer of hope, this glimmer of possibility that a world like that creates, where Marx talks about in the Grundrisse, where eventually the machines move themselves. We become the watchmen of the machines. And when we are no longer alienated from our desires, when we're able to think of something and create it, then we have the potential for history to begin. The history of struggle and so on, and struggle over scarce resources ends, and real human history where we are gods, no longer alienated from our godly nature, begins.
I just want to underline what you said at the beginning there about how the disaffection or the basically the jealousy that might be inspired in working people when they look up on the hill and see the McMansion or the straight up mansion and the wonders and the plenty that the capitalist class enjoys, and the hatred that is instilled in their heart for that inequality, how that is fundamental to driving revolutionary change, according to Marx, and that we shouldn't that is not the main thing that a consumerist society is bringing forward. If the struggle against consumerism is not the struggle to suppress people's desires for a better life, but it is, something that I remember being kind of taught when I was undergraduate, way back when, that specifically marketing creates an artificial desire that can never be filled within people, that we're being taught to want what we don't have, and not to accept and understand the wonder of what already is. And this was being taught to me, I think, through sort of a post-structuralist analysis, and also, it's through the communications department, but as a left-wing kind of perspective. So, there's, I just want to underline the fact that all of that, that sort of psychological approach, to the left has to be at the very least criticized deeply and really re-examined if you're going to embrace a forward-looking Marxist project for socialism. And so I'm disagreeing with you.
No, don't get me wrong. Like, obviously, I'm not saying like some of the crap that's produced within capitalism is a good thing. Like, you have these like immense forces of production, and we're using them to create like little rubber ducks. You know, that's ridiculous.
I like little rubber ducks. I think they're cute.
I don't get what the point of a rubber duck is. That's why I always use that as an example. But the idea is that what happened was that people started to see I think a lot of that critique is actually brought in some of mainstream economics, whose whole point, by the way, like marginal utility, I don't know if it's the whole point, it's necessarily correct to say this, but it did save economics from Marx. There were already inklings, you know, you had Ricardian socialism and so on. There were already inklings that the labor theory of value had revolutionary implications, and therefore, in order to save economics from that conclusion, then you needed to have a new idea, and therefore we have like this idea of supply and demand, and so people started to think that capitalism exists because we demand it. But so if we could just get people to stop wanting somehow, some way, we would stop capitalism. Except that dangerously mimics the fact that as workers, you have to stop wanting because you need to get paid less, right? You want to stop, you don't want to desire too much. You want to be satisfied on as low wages as possible. Within a nation, you know, you want your workers to be ascetic. You want the workers of other nations to be profligate. So it actually works wonderfully to tell people that they shouldn't desire more. And then, of course, it then says the whole reason why this monster exists is because we demand in the market. So then it becomes our fault, which then leaves out the fact that demand often has to be created after the fact. So then why do we wind up having to create demand? Well, because of capitalist competition. Because of competition, you wind up producing much, much more for less, but you need market clearing. You need to be able to sell all of those products. And so you have to drum up demand. So the problem isn't us desiring it. It's much deeper and intrinsic to capitalism itself. And so no amount of, reforming people's subjectivity is going to solve what is an essential problem to the fundamental workings of capitalism.
Right. You only have a few more minutes here before you have to run off and do other things. Care
for my little baby Yoda. Somebody said
care for your kids, and then stay up all night and then get ready for probably, I don't know, tomorrow's Saturday, I guess, so you don't have to pull an all-nighter and teach tomorrow. But I want to give you a chance to see if just a moment here to see if there's maybe one last question we can tackle before you go. And also, actually, before, as people are maybe asking a question, I'll say, when in March you might start doing some of these live streams on your own, and people should expect that in March. Do you think you have? Because I know you said you have lots of free time for this. So
that's the issue. Is I have very, very, very little time, but there's so many wonderful people that I like to talk to. I think Ralph Leonard's really great. I want to talk to him again. We did try to talk. There was a huge delay on the line. So,
he was just too far away for that to work well. He was in Africa at the time.
Yeah, he was in Nigeria. Yeah, and like I find thing is I'm a little ambivalent, scared about doing live streams because I'm actually like a very slow thinker. I'm a very slow writer. I take a long time to decide what I really think about things, and you kind of like in the internet world, you have to be like 100% certain, and you can't be possibly wrong or you'll be denounced, and that's really scary.
But we got to create the space where, in real time, people can think and be seen to be thinking and get things wrong, and then come back and do it again next week and correct themselves. I think that's the only way.
Wonderful thing about debate, which is why you need to have so much, which is why I debate people that I absolutely disagree with. I love doing that because it always sheds light on inconsistencies in my arguments.
Yeah. So let's see if there's one last question from anyone here. Let's see. Well, it looks like there's people you know how it is online. People are chatting and arguing with themselves as we talk. So let's see if I can throw something up here. It's just, I mean, this is the kind of comments that were grow up people. They're talking not to us, but to each other. Yeah, well, listen, Ashley, it's 8:39. You were saying that you wanted to get off the stream at 8:40.
Yes, my husband has to go deliver pizzas. So,
well, do you ever get a free pizza out of that deal?
I do sometimes. Yes.
All right,
And I'm slowly getting larger and larger every time you see me.
I haven't noticed that. All right. Well, thanks, Ashley. I'm going to end the broadcast and we'll do this again soon. And then you'll be doing it on your own soon.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep.